October 2018, Arkhangai Province, Central Mongolia. When Batsaikhan Erdene began to dismantle his own house, the sky was still clear. There was no snow. There was no storm. The grass was still visible beneath the light morning frost. The other shepherds remained scattered across the plain, enjoying the last days of open pasture. No one breaks camp before the first big snowfall, but Batsaikhan dismounted. His wife Naran held the ropes of the gear's circular roof while the wind blew stronger than usual for that time of year. The eldest son, Temujin, silently gathered the stakes. Little Sarul was carrying pieces of felt that were almost bigger than herself. From the other side of the hill, someone shouted, "He's running away from a winter that hasn't even arrived yet." Laughter. Another added, "He'll come back asking for space when he realizes he went too far." Batsaikhan did not reply. He was looking south, to the narrow valley where the sun first shone at dawn, where the Siberian wind would pass overhead, if he had calculated correctly, because if he had been wrong, he wouldn't just have lost comfort, he would lose the flock, and on the steppe, losing the herd is losing the future. 3 weeks later, when the wind finally arrived, nobody was laughing anymore. Batsaikhan was not the oldest member of the clan, not even the most influential. He was known for speaking little and observing a great deal. Some called it caution, others called it chronic distrust. He had grown up listening to his father's stories about the dzud, the catastrophic winter that follows the summer drought. First, the animals lose weight. Then the snow covers what little remains. And then the cold seals everything like stone. The father always repeated, "It's not the cold that kills first. It's the mistake." That year, the summer had been uneven. Less rain, more fragile pasture. This meant that if the cold weather came on strong, the animals would be less prepared. Most decided to stay where the grass was still accessible. It was logical. It was obvious. It was immediate. Batsaikhan chose the invisible path. He descended into the valley known as Kokmod, sheltered by a gentle slope to the north. There, the Siberian wind would lose strength at ground level. It wasn't the place with the best pasture. It was the place with the best survival rate. In the first few days, the decision seemed wrong. The animals had to walk further to find grass. The family worked double shifts. The argil was still accumulated in a smaller quantity than ideal. Naran asked once while adjusting the last layer of felt, "He is sure?" He gazed at the horizon. The wind changed direction as evening fell. "I don't have one, but I know where I don't want to be." Meanwhile, the other camps remained open, scattered, confident. The mistake was priceless. But he was getting closer. The Kokmod Valley seemed too small to offer security. It was narrower than the open fields where the others were. Less visible grass, more shade in the early morning hours. To those passing by at a distance, it seemed like an overly defensive decision. "He's scared." That's what one of the neighbors commented while guiding the horses up the higher slope. Batsaikhan heard. He didn't answer. He wasn't looking for space. I was looking for an angle. On the steppe, the wind doesn't strike from above first. He scrapes the floor. He enters from below. He finds invisible cracks. That's why he didn't position the dzud in isolation. He called 2 close families, distant relatives, and suggested something unusual for that time of year. Form the course in advance. The closed circle. It wasn't officially winter yet. No one forms the circle before the first serious storm. But he insisted. The doors facing south. The rear of the gers forming a continuous barrier to the north. The distances between each structure are reduced to a minimum. One of the families refused. "We're fine where we are." The other hesitated, but accepted. Not out of conviction, just in case. In the following days, Batsaikhan began reinforcing the perimeter with low stones, blocks of dried clay piled around the tents. It seemed like an exaggeration. The sky was still blue, but the air felt different. Naran noticed first. The silence of the birds. The way the horses huddled together at night, even without a command. Something was organizing itself above them, and they were still setting up their defenses. The real cold arrived without warning. There was no major initial storm, just a sudden drop. 18 degrees here one night, 27 degrees here in the following. The scattered camps felt it first. The animals began to move restlessly. Some newborn lambs did not survive until the second night. It wasn't the dzud yet, but it was a warning. In the valley, the circle was already closed. The animals were led to the center of the kur every night, 100 bodies breathing together. The air inside seemed less biting. Slight difference. 3 degrees, maybe. But 3 degrees changed the rate of heat loss. Even so, something went wrong. On the third night, with temperatures below 30 days, the fire almost went out. Temujin had taken over the night shift. The Algiers burned faster than expected. The ventilation needed to be adjusted to prevent excessive smoke. For a few minutes, the inside of the GER became too cold. Sarul began to tremble even under the furs. Naran woke up before the silence became dangerous. Batsaikhan stood up without apparent haste. He adjusted the opening in the roof. He reorganized the fuel. It reduced the air intake at the base. The fire is back. But he realized something that the others hadn't yet understood. Winter was not just beginning. He was speeding up, and the real test had not yet arrived. The first serious snowstorm arrived at night. No thunder, no show, just a white curtain descending with a side wind. In less than 4 hours, the valley lost its shape. The trails have disappeared. The outer piles were partially buried. The camps, scattered across the upper part of the steppe, received the direct impact of the Siberian wind. In the Kuk Mod Kur, the circle held. It didn't block the wind completely, and that would be impossible, but its strength broke at ground level. Even so, the real problem wasn't the wind. That was what came next. When snow covers the grass before the animals are strong enough, invisible wear and tear begins. The following morning, Batsaikhan left before sunrise. The snow was deeper than he had anticipated. No review yet, but heavier. The horses needed to break through the topsoil so that sheep and goats could reach the grass below. He organized the herd to trample strategic areas. Small victory. They managed to create clearings. But that afternoon, the temperature dropped once again. At 34-degree rise, the top layer froze. It turned into a crust. Now the animals could no longer break through easily. The food was there, but inaccessible. That was the real beginning of the risk. On the other side of the hill, 2 shepherds began moving their flocks to lower areas. Too late. One of them lost 6 sheep on the first night after the crust froze. In the valley, Batsaikhan changed the plan. Instead of spreading the herd out during the day, he began alternating areas of concentrated trampling. Less space, more depth. It worked. For 3 days. In the room, the wind changed direction. It didn't come from the north. It came from the west. It entered the valley sideways. The circle wasn't prepared for that angle. The exterior of one of the gers began to vibrate under continuous bursts of wind. One of the families that had agreed to form the course began to have doubts. Perhaps we should move everything back to open terrain. Moving through deep snow would mean animal exhaustion. To stay meant trusting that the valley would withstand a wind for which it had not been chosen. Batsaikhan walked to the edge of the perimeter. He felt the rush of fluid on his face. He observed the slope of the hillside. The wind was swirling down, not in a straight line. He did something that wasn't in the initial plan. He ordered the side panel to be partially dismantled. He moved it even closer to the circle, reducing the opening through which the wind was entering. It seemed counterintuitive to dismount during strong winds, but leaving it as it was would create a rift. They worked for 2 hours under gusts of wind that froze their hands. The structure has been readjusted. The wind continued, but it lost momentum in the interior. Small victory. That night, the center of the Kur maintained a temperature a few degrees higher than the outer part of the steppe, but something was still unresolved. The animals were expending too much energy just to stay upright, and the real winter had not yet shown its limit. The temperature dropped to 41 degrees in the second week of November. The air no longer burned. They were anesthetizing. The ice crust on the snow had become too thick for the sheep to break through on their own. The horses were slower. The herd was beginning to lose weight. Batsaikhan decided to expand the trampling area beyond the valley. It was a risky calculation. If they could open up a wider strip, they could expose more grass. If they lingered too long, the cold would drain energy from the animals, and from themselves. He and Temujin left before dawn with part of the flock. Naran remained at the camp with Sarul and the newborns. The wind seemed calm. Too much silence. About a kilometer from the valley, the terrain changed slightly in slope. There, the crust was thicker. The horses began to slip. One of them fell. He stood up. It fell again. It was at that moment that the wind returned. Not gradual. Abrupt. Horizontal gusts of wind kicked up dry snow from the ground, reducing visibility to just a few meters. Temujin lost the outline of the valley. The world has become white and indistinct. Batsaikhan signaled for them to retreat, but the flock was already scattered. A young sheep fell and did not get up. Another one started moving away in the wrong direction, following the wind. And then Temujin also fell, not out of weakness, due to lost guidance. He stood up too quickly. It turned in the opposite direction from the valley. The mistake wasn't dramatic. It was small, a wrong turn of a few degrees. But in a side snowstorm, a few degrees become kilometers. Batsaikhan realized this before his son had strayed too far. He ran against the wind. The cold was robbing air from my lungs. He grabbed Temujin by the arm. He didn't say anything. It simply pointed in the right direction. But at that moment they realized something worse. The flock was splitting up. Half of them were going in the wrong direction. Splitting up to search for each group meant exposing oneself for too long. Choosing one side meant losing the other. He made the hardest choice. He guided Temujin back to the valley. He abandoned the sheep, and they scattered. There was no way to save everything. When they returned to the Kur, Naran saw before they could speak. The number was lower. There were no charges. There was no question, just silence. That night, as the animals huddled together in the center of the circle, the wind picked up even more. The protected space was functioning, but the cost was starting to show. Each lost sheep meant less warmth in the center. Less is reserved for the following months. Sarul coughed during the early morning hours. Not strong, but enough for Naran to bring her closer to the fire. The fuel was running low faster than expected, and winter had not yet reached its peak. The mistake was minor. The consequences would be long-lasting. The dzud arrived at the end of November, not like a single storm, but as a sequel. Heavy snow, then ice, then the wind, then more snow on ice. The steppe has turned into a solid surface. The herds that were still scattered in the higher areas began to decline rapidly. No access to grass, no shelter from the direct wind. In the Kukmad Valley, the Kur remained standing, but the city center was quieter. The animals no longer moved with the same energy. They were breathing thick vapor, pressed against each other. The temperature reached 48 degrees on a moonless night. Inside the gyr, the makeshift thermometer indicated something around 12 degrees. Survivable, but only to the extreme. That same night, a horse broke through the outer line of the circle, probably startled by something in the dark, perhaps just disoriented by the constant wind. The sound of the impact woke everyone up. If the horse opened a large enough gap, the wind would find a way through. If the wind were to find a way through, the microclimate would disappear. Batsaikhan left immediately. No shouting, no rush. Direct movement only. The cold hit his face like a blade. The horse was partially trapped in the side structure of one of the gyrs. If it continued struggling, it would tear the outer felt. He approached slowly. He placed his hand on the animal's neck. He waited for his breathing to slow down. He carefully detached the taut structure, using his own body as a barrier against the wind. Temujin was holding the rope. Naran kept the gyr's entrance partially closed to reduce the draft. Those minutes were far too long, but the horse was led into the circle. The structure remained intact. Small victory, but the wear and tear was accumulating. On the other side of the hill, one of the families that had refused to form the Kur appeared at dawn. The father came alone, walking against the wind. Half of the herd had died during the night. The animals were scattered, unable to break through the frozen crust. He didn't ask for help immediately. He simply stood there in front of the circle of gyrs. The October trial had already lost its voice. Batsaikhan opened up space in the Kur. No speech, no memory of the laughter. They adjusted the structures to expand the inner perimeter. More animals meant more heat, but it also means higher fuel consumption, more breathing, more internal humidity. It was a calculated risk. If they refused, that family would lose the rest of the herd. If they accepted, everyone would be pushed to the limit of the system. They accepted. That night, the center of the circle seemed alive. Compressed bodies, steam rising like an internal mist. The thermometer rose 3 degrees. Enough, but the fuel was running out. The stacked Algiers wouldn't be enough until February if the cold weather continued at this rate, and he would continue. The following morning, Sarul had a slight fever. Nothing dramatic, but enough to keep Naran awake longer than usual. The system was working, but it was at its structural limit. Any mistake now would be significant. It would be definitive. The cold weather didn't let up in December. He settled down, which was worse. 50 degrees C has become the nightly routine. The steppe no longer seemed like an open place. It looked like a mineral surface. Only the Kur retained human form amidst that hardened white. The family that had mocked them in October was now splitting the circle. At first they didn't talk much. After that, almost nothing. The man who had called it paranoia was now waking up before dawn to help reorganize the animals at the center, not out of explicit gratitude, out of necessity. The system only worked if everyone maintained the perfect format. The felt layers needed to be checked daily, Algiers carefully redistributed. The gaps were adjusted as the wind changed. Batsaikhan did not mention the past. He didn't offer lengthy advice. It was just showing, with gestures, with positioning, in silence. On one of the coldest nights, the neighbor noticed that his own gur was losing heat faster than usual. A small flaw in the outer felt overlay. Nothing visible from a distance, but enough to create an internal current. He could have tried to solve it himself. Instead, he walked to the entrance of Batsaikhan. He stood there for a few seconds. Then he simply said, "Can you take a look?" No excuses. No explanation needed. Batsaikhan stood up. She dressed the deal. She went out with him, readjusted the outer layer. He tightened the strings at a different angle. The orientation of one of the blocks of clay stacked as a side barrier was changed. He didn't explain why. The neighbor observed. He learned too late. But he learned. That same week, another camp in the upper part of the steppe was abandoned. The losses were too great. Some dead animals remained frozen where they fell. Others were sold at a low price before they lost all their weight. In the valley, losses occurred, but they were smaller. The system wasn't perfect. It was just more durable. In early January, during a particularly clear early morning, the sky was completely open. No clouds to trap heat. The cold weather hit harder than expected. The fire inside the GR died down at the wrong time. Temujin was too exhausted to wake up on his own. Sarul was fast asleep. Naran first noticed that the air was too cold for that time of day. Batsaikhan called out in a low voice. He stood up immediately. He reorganized the remaining Algiers. Reduced ventilation. I brought 2 newborn lambs closer to the indoor area. The temperature stabilized slowly. The system survived on its own margins. The next morning, the neighbor brought a small bag of dried clay. It wasn't enough, but that was all that remained of his reserve. He placed it next to the entrance. He didn't say anything. Batsaikhan doesn't either. The circle remained intact until February. No celebrations marked the coldest day. No celebrations marked the final storm. The steppe simply began to soften. The ice lost its rigidity. The snow became heavy. The wind lost its precision. And then, in March, the valley began to reveal patches of grass. March did not bring immediate heat. It only brought longer light. The sun began to linger for a few extra minutes over the south slope. The ice lost its metallic sound when stepped on. The snow stopped cutting through the air. When they dismantled the curb, there was no ceremony. Each generation, returned to exist independently. The stones were scattered across the ground again. The remaining part of Algiers was reorganized for the transition period. The animals walked out of the circle as if it had never been necessary. The Kokmad Valley was empty within a few hours. No foundation, no permanent marks, only areas where the snow had melted first. The final numbers were tallied without dramatization. They lost part of the herd, but they kept the core. The neighbors who remained on the higher ground of the steppe did not have the same outcome. Some sold animals to cover debts. Others drastically reduced their herds. The family that had silently asked for help now maintained their camp closer to the valley in the following seasons. Not out of obligation, from memory. Temujin began to observe the wind as his father had done, not as a superstition, as a standard. Sarul was no longer coughing. Naran carefully rearranged the layers of felt. Batsaikhan did not receive public recognition. No formal meeting. Not a word of leadership. But when October returned the following year, 3 families descended into the valley before the first snowfall. No announcement. No debate. The decision no longer seemed like paranoia. It seemed prudent. The dzud will continue to return every decade. The steppe does not change its character. But now more people know where the wind doesn't reach first. Mongolians don't survive temperatures as low as 50 degrees Celsius because they defy the cold. They survive because they understand the cold. The steppe offers no shelter. She gives signs. Those who learn to read them carry their strength with them. And when winter departs, no monuments remain. Only families remain there.